Good afternoon. I'm Susan Hatters Friedman. I'm a professor of forensic psychiatry as well as reproductive biology, which is what we call obstetrics and gynecology in Cleveland, as well as pediatrics and law. I'm excited to be asked to present with you this afternoon. I'm going to be talking about postpartum psychosis, helping with understanding the diagnosis and also the intersection with the justice system. So I have no disclosures. What I'm going to talk about, we're going to talk about what are the characteristic symptoms of postpartum psychosis to make sure we're all on the same page of understanding it. Then from the symptoms flow the risks, which are very serious with postpartum psychosis and which I'll discuss. I'll discuss the treatment of this disorder. And then I'll also, throughout my talk, be discussing some of the concerns that are inherent in this space because of it not being listed in the DSM. So despite it not being listed in psychiatry's DSM, we know a lot about postpartum psychosis, and it is not altogether uncommon. So out of 1,000 deliveries, we see 1 or 2 or sometimes 3 mothers experiencing postpartum psychosis. As far as the phenomenon, it often begins in the first 2 weeks after the baby is born. It can also occur in the later postpartum months. But as you'll hear me describing these symptoms, think about them happening in a person who has this vulnerable baby, who the person is responsible for everything for that baby. The other reason why I will say that postpartum psychosis is one of the most concerning mental health disorders out there is because it very rapidly starts and it rapidly evolves. So whereas other types of psychosis, such as in schizophrenia or psychosis within depression, have a more gradual onset, people start developing symptoms over months. Postpartum psychosis is very different. It can happen over the course of days, and often, as I'll describe, have some pretty scary symptoms happening. Now, despite it not being in the DSM, it's actually been described dating back to the time of Hippocrates. And the literature describes that Hippocrates discussed a case of a woman in the postpartum who suddenly had an onset of confusion, of hallucinations, of delirium, so confusion in a waxing and waning sort of way, and insomnia. It next came to great attention by Marseille, who was a physician describing this phenomenon, and after whom the International Marseille Society is named, which is a maternal mental health conference and a place to learn a lot more about mental health and the latest treatments. Another text that I like to go back to is The Yellow Wallpaper, which is also from the 1800s. And this was by Charlotte Perkins Gilman. And when she wrote it, it has been described as semi-autobiographical. And I really like her description of this presentation during pregnancy. And the reason during the postpartum. And the reason it's called the yellow wallpaper is the yellow wallpaper becomes a important character almost in her description. So in brief, this is the 1800s, right before there were medical cures, for example, and you have this woman described as experiencing these mental health symptoms in the postpartum, and so the treatment was, of course, to put her in a room in the country, and the room had yellow wallpaper, and so she talks, as you can read as well, about getting stuck, getting focused and preoccupied on this yellow wallpaper, figuring out that there must be some sort of pattern there that has the answers to things, recognizing that other people were starting to look at the wallpaper as well, and that this might be the secret clue to solving the mysteries. So, okay, so that's from the 1800s, and today we're in 2024. Here's a paper that we wrote that got published last year in 2023 in Current Psychiatry Reports, where we went through what is the current state of the art of knowledge and of scientific evidence about issues in postpartum psychosis. So we talked a bit, if you're interested, I can make it available as well. We talk about the genetic knowledge, about medications, about prevention and recovery. We talk about the issues with postpartum psychosis not being in the DSM, and I'll talk about that throughout this talk, but you can imagine some of the issues being physicians aren't aware of it to make the diagnosis, to get women the urgent treatment that they need in the case of postpartum psychosis, and then also if there is an intersection with the legal system, how to explain that to the courts. All right, so to describe the phenomenology, the symptoms that a woman may experience, as I said, these begin in the postpartum and usually very abruptly. She may develop grandiose, bizarre delusions. So sudden onset of these fixed false beliefs. And they can be about a range of topics, but they often revolve around the person she's around the most, the infant. So she starts getting very scary and concerning thoughts, often revolving around the infant, perhaps revolving around her partner as well. She develops paranoia about others' motives and about perhaps there's some secret thing going on, such as we saw in the yellow wallpaper that the clues were meant to be there. Now, those are symptoms that we are very used to thinking about occurring in any psychosis, right? Delusions and hallucinations. However, postpartum psychosis is unique because she often also has symptoms which we traditionally think of as occurring in other mental health disorders. So mood symptoms and then cognitive symptoms as well. So mood lability. So she may find her mood going from happy to sad to very upset in a rather quicker manner. Now, as far as hallucinations, again, we typically think of those as psychotic phenomena. And we know that, for example, if someone has schizophrenia, the type of hallucination or experience they're most likely to have within the hallucination is of auditory hallucinations or voices. Now, however, you can have hallucinations that are of any type of any of our different senses that we have. And so a unique factor or a unique feature that we sometimes see in postpartum psychosis is it's not only voices. So it may be visual hallucinations, visions. It may be olfactory hallucinations, so smells, unusual smells that don't exist that she's experiencing. It could even be gustatory or tastes she's experiencing. And then tactile hallucinations, so feeling as if she's being touched when there's no one there, for example. And you may have these different range of hallucinations with postpartum psychosis, or you could have only auditory hallucinations, but these other hallucinations that tend to be rarer in schizophrenia, we can also see in postpartum psychosis. And then I said about cognitive symptoms as well. So all of this is going on. It is sudden. It is rapid. It would certainly be confusing, and she experiences cognitive disorganization as well, oftentimes. So as I'm saying all these different symptoms, if you had not heard of much about postpartum psychosis before, you're seeing that it's much more fulminant. It resembles these different mental health disorders rather than just psychotic symptoms. So it's said to resemble delirium, that confusion-like state that we are more used to seeing in medical problems when someone's, hospitalized in the ICU, for example. But we see it in postpartum psychosis. Dysphoric mania, it also resembles. So a dysphoric mania being someone who is experiencing manic symptoms with depressive symptoms around the same time. We talked about the abrupt onset and rapid evolution, and I'll talk about more some of the data, but it's most often correlated with bipolar disorder, which is a little counterintuitive because people presume it's most likely to be related to schizophrenia, but it's actually most related to bipolar disorder. And when we're thinking about prevention, as we'll talk about later, one of the groups of people who we want to really be thinking about targeted prevention with is women who have a history of a diagnosis of bipolar disorder. Now, I want to make a comment as well about the postpartum period. So in obstetrics and gynecology versus in psychiatry, and then versus in research and versus in the DSM. So the time period in the DSM has been 4 weeks. The time period that we often see in studies is about 3 months. The time period in the ICD-10, 6 weeks. But then when we're thinking about clinics and setting them up and thinking about women's risk of postpartum depression, postpartum psychosis, we tend to think about the first year postpartum. And when we've set up clinics in the past, we even, set them up for the first 3 years because of this being a difficult time, hormonal fluctuations, mental health issues, as well as this vulnerable little baby and little toddler. And so even if postpartum psychosis were in the DSM, there's a little concern that this very short window of time that the DSM allows for postpartum disorders to occur, some of the cases are not going to be in that window and therefore wouldn't meet criteria. Okay, so postpartum psychosis is most often correlated with bipolar disorder. If you follow people over time who have been diagnosed with postpartum psychosis, you'll find that the majority of them end up long-term experiencing bipolar symptoms, manias, and depressions as well, and so often merit a diagnosis of bipolar disorder. However, we also, all of us are well aware that there has to be a first time for a first presentation of anything, right? And we know that often happens in young adulthood, and pregnancy often happens in young adulthood as well. So this may very well be the very first time that she's ever experienced any mental health symptoms. Postpartum psychosis is, as you're hearing, a unique disorder that often presents in a very specific way. And so this has allowed for researchers to begin doing genetic studies looking for the genetics of postpartum psychosis. And there is promising work being done there as well. Okay, now when we're doing the differential diagnosis, when we're seeing someone present with some of these symptoms and the psychiatrist or the emergency room doctor needs to figure out, is this postpartum psychosis? I just want to review some of the other mental health concerns that people can have in the postpartum and the things that we need to be thinking about. So the big thing that we need to make sure, because it has very different treatment, is it postpartum depression, which of course is much more common. So depending on the study, up to about 20% of moms, 1 in 6, 1 in 5, depending on the study. And postpartum depression is obviously very common in the postpartum year for mothers, but it will have symptoms of the depressive disorders. So difficulty sleeping when the baby sleeps is one of the screening questions that we ask, for example, about postpartum depression. But then we're asking about other symptoms of depression rather than psychosis. Now, just like any other time in life, postpartum depression could, if it's severe and not treated, turn into a postpartum depression with psychotic features as well. Now, another very common thing that we get consulted for in reproductive psychiatry is baby blues, which is actually a normative thing. It's up to 3/4 of moms experience a few days early in the postpartum when you can imagine the hormones are going crazy, the stress levels are going crazy, the she might have had pain in delivery that was significant, and then difficulty with sleeping and recovery. This is a period of sleep that's perhaps messed up, some irritability and stress, but resolves on its own with support. We're also, of course, thinking of schizophrenia, and a big difference would be that onset of symptoms, as I discussed. Another big thing that we get referrals for that people are concerned is this postpartum psychosis, is postpartum obsessive compulsive disorder. So obsessive compulsive disorder is something that we don't uncommonly see in the postpartum either, and certainly women with who experience obsessional thinking and compulsive actions regarding the baby who they don't want to hurt, who they want to keep safe, but often hearing about postpartum psychosis in the media, et cetera. So in obsessive compulsive disorder, one's so-called reality testing is intact, so there aren't delusional thinking, there aren't hallucinations, and rather than thoughts being delusions, they would often be obsessional thoughts and worries about something bad happening to the baby, often accidentally, but she becomes preoccupied and focused on those obsessions. And then we also need to think about so-called organic or medical causes of this presentation. So as you heard me describing these symptoms of clusters of psychosis, of depression, and of confusional states, we want to make sure that there's not a medical cause. Is it related to blood losses, related to an infection from delivery? Could it be something substance-induced or medication-induced if she was started on steroids or something? And so we want there to be a good medical evaluation to make sure if there's a medical cause that needs treated as well. Okay, and this is from a paper that we wrote. These are some of the factors which elevate someone's risk of developing postpartum psychosis: a personal history, a family history, that's getting to the genetic piece, having bipolar disorder, having schizoaffective disorder, as I mentioned, these hormonal shifts at birth, and then sleep deprivation as well. And as I mentioned, there are serious risks of postpartum psychosis. The three big things that we think about the most are suicide, neglect of the child, and infanticide. So suicide overall is a leading cause of death in the first year postpartum. And as we get better, as a medical advances of treating other causes of postpartum death, we're left with suicide. Now, the child neglect that we worry about is often due to these confusion and disorganized thinking. For example, one mom was heating up empty bottles and trying to feed them to the baby. Another walking out in the snow because of confusion of getting the child dressed, etc. So you can imagine it's difficult to care for a baby if you're having difficulty caring for yourself because of this disorganization. And then the risk of infanticide has been described as being a 4% risk in postpartum psychosis if it's not treated. And this is often due to rapidly changing delusional thinking that we were discussing. So then this is where also the justice system comes in. There are some things we think about as psychiatrists about increasing the risk, and some specific delusions that may increase the risk of the individual infant. Now, two different terms I want to just briefly introduce. There's neonaticide is one thing, and neonaticide is murder of the child on the first day of life. And very occasionally, these are psychotic mothers with psychosis. Much more commonly, they're women who had hidden pregnancies beforehand. And infanticide. Infanticide is often used to describe murder of the infant in the first year of life at the hand of the parent. Filicide is murder of the child by the parent at any time. And when we did a review of the world literature looking at psychiatric studies, the factors that we found commonly occurring in these women who killed were psychosis, being suicidal themselves and taking their child with them, and depression. And there were often other stressors going on as well, limited social support or substance use as well. Now, there are multiple motives or reasons why parents kill their children, whether they're a father or a mother. And these 5 were described initially by my mentor, Phillip Resnick, in the 60s, and they're still used around the world in research and in evaluating cases for the courts. So this is also from an article that we wrote. The 5 motives described, you see here, are fatal maltreatment, unwanted child, partner revenge, altruistic, and acutely psychotic filicides or infanticides. Now, in the very right column, you'll see what is the relevance to postpartum psychosis of each of these types of child murder. So fatal maltreatment is the end result of chronic abuse or neglect. And this is the most common cause of child murder, but as you see, it's rarely related to postpartum psychosis, as are the cases where the child's unwanted or cases of partner revenge. However, when we get to the altruistic or acutely psychotic types, altruism being murder out of love, so the loving mother killing their child, believing that they're preventing earthly suffering, etc., is often related to postpartum depression, postpartum psychosis, as are other cases where the mother was psychotic. And an example where there was an altruistic motive was the case of Andrea Yates, which my mentor, Dr. Resnick, testified in as well, which you may recall. There seems to be so much confusion about these motives that I had recently written an article about it in Huffington Post as well. So, as you're hearing me speak, hopefully you're thinking you agree with me that this is often a psychiatric emergency. There's a risk of harming oneself, harming others. There's a risk to the infant. There's confusion about the infant's care, and often emergency hospitalization for safety in the short term is necessary. But as we're all aware, the emergency treatment is going to be different than long-term treatment. So what we want to do, it's very important that we have a relationship and support provided not only for the mother, but for any family member, partner, etc. Her sleep is very important, as you can imagine, in this difficult, stressful time as well. We, in general, are going to aim for therapy with one medication. Sometimes in the short term, someone may need like a antipsychotic medication plus a benzodiazepine initially, but then the longer term plan is generally one medication if possible. Often we all know the phrase that breast is best, but in some cases, breastfeeding will be problematic related to medication effects, but also related to the need for sleep. So this is also from our article. We talk about the different treatment plans, and I think this is an important piece as well. So when we're thinking about the treatment, we think about what is the risk of harm to herself, of harm to the infant. Thinking about getting child protective services involved if necessary for the risk to the infant. We want to evaluate and make sure that we're not missing a medical reason rather than a psychiatric reason for this presentation. Hospitalization in the short term for safety is often indicated and allows for a period of safety planning as well, and education of the family, as we all know that this is something that there is not much education in the community about, unfortunately. And then thinking about medications, which are generally, as I said, going to be a mood stabilizer and or antipsychotic medication to treat this range of symptoms that you're hearing me mention. Now, we also know when we're thinking about safety that we want to keep these things on our mind as an outpatient in the community as well. So we want to do closer follow-up with the mom and hopefully partner or other support. Is there home support that can happen? But also thinking through this notification of Child Protective Services, and they often have access there to additional programming that we might not within the world of psychiatry. And the goal obviously being to keep the family together, but with the support necessary so that things can be safe. And then really the importance of family and everyone understanding and being on the same page. So when we think about prevention, it's really important to me, this education piece, because it's not in the DSM, so the community doesn't understand it, and this mom has been discharged and is likely home alone with the infant when these scary symptoms start happening. We need to discuss the risks with people during and before pregnancy, especially people who are at higher risk, who have a family member with a history of this or a personal history themselves, or people who have bipolar disorder and are becoming pregnant. And so a general recommendation in addition to the education is following up more often for prevention, then having doctors who understand about it as well, and especially for those at risk. So I've been trying as well to write articles for doctors, because again, if this is not something that is in the DSM, it's not something that doctors have on their radar even. And then another thing that I've been involved in is another grassroots effort. So Megan Cliffell is a survivor and a memoir writer who has been sharing her story to educate people in the community about postpartum psychosis, as well as educating doctors. And so we've spoken to different news outlets as well to try and get this diagnosis the attention that it deserves, so that people will have the diagnosis made appropriately and get the treatment they need. But that doesn't mean that courts will necessarily understand it, especially, as I said, when it's not in the DSM. Now, with the ICD, that is one way that this and other postpartum disorders can be brought up. But even if you look up or recall in your own mind the Andrea Yates case, where there was all of this discussion about postpartum psychosis, and in fact, her psychiatrist, because she had postpartum psychosis after various pregnancies that were very difficult to treat, it was, in the news that her psychiatrist had recommended even not having other children because of her postpartum psychosis. But still, in court, the diagnoses were things like schizoaffective disorder, with postpartum psychosis not being listed in the DSM. So it does make it more murky with it not being a diagnosis that's quote unquote in the book. Okay, so we've talked about a lot of things in this half hour. I hope I've convinced you that it is critical to diagnose postpartum psychosis, to notice these symptoms, and then if someone's having these symptoms, to get in and get rapid treatment. Also, there's so much stigma, as we know, in our society with the diagnosis of any mental health disorder, but in particular in pregnancy and the postpartum, which, people think is of course, it's the most happy time of your life. You, of course, shouldn't have mental health symptoms, when we, in actuality, know that the time in a woman's life that she's most likely to experience mental health problems is in the postpartum. But you can imagine, especially someone who's never had mental health symptoms before, they suddenly have these abrupt onset of these scary symptoms of psychosis, of mood disorder, of confusion. And then there's also the stigma. So she's often going to be very scared, very scared of letting anyone know she's experiencing these symptoms, afraid of losing custody of her infant, and her infant and or partner and or family may be coming involved in her delusional thinking as well. So not only is it a scary place to be, but in a brief interaction in an emergency room with a doctor or a brief interaction with police, she may well be trying to cover up the symptoms because of those fears that she rightfully has. So we've also talked in this half hour about postpartum psychosis is a different entity than postpartum depression. They are both important to be able to diagnose and to get people psychological help that they need or medications if needed. But we need to keep in mind these are different disorders. The medications are going to be different. The treatment plans are going to be different. The safety risk is going to be different. And then we've talked in some detail about the risks of missing the diagnosis and the problems for the community with it not being in the DSM, the problems for doctors training with it not being in the DSM, and then also in the courtroom if tragedy has happened and we're left to explain that. And so one of the things is explaining the various different well-described 5 motives for child murder by parents, and then discussing the postpartum disorders in light of those criteria, those categories as well. So I look forward to seeing everyone at the discussion hour later, and thank you for your attention.